In 1936, it felt like the whole of the world was waiting for a broadcast by King Edward VIII. People knew this would be probably when he renounced the throne and abdicated. And in probably one of the first occasions where it happened, the broadcast was to go live around the world. And in New York, there was a radio station ready to broadcast the words of the king. Just before he was meant to go live, someone tripped over the wire that was to carry the broadcast and broke it in half. There was no time to fix it, but a quick-thinking radio engineer grasped both ends of the cable and held them. And apparently that allowed the transmission to travel through him and out to the world. Now, I did try and check that story. I can't find if it's true, but it's a brilliant illustration of what the role of a prophet is in the Old Testament. God transmitted his message, his kingly message for his people through the prophets. And he did that in three basic ways. First of all, there was proclamation. That's just what we would call preaching. God's truth was proclaimed by the words of the prophet when he preached. There was prediction. Prophets occasionally predicted what God was going to do and what was going to happen to God's people in the future. And finally, there was demonstration. God would ask the prophet to do something that would demonstrate, show God's people some truth about him or them. And scholars call this prophetic symbolism. But if you want an easier way to understand it, it's like a live-action parable. In 2016, a scandal involving a vicar's wife and an actor was plastered all over the front pages of the tabloids in the UK. A vicar's wife met actor Robson Green at the gym, and they started an affair, and then she deserted her husband, gave up her faith, and moved in with the actor. And so I remember one of the headlines on the tabloids read, "Vicar dumped by wife for romps with Robson." Now, if there had been tabloid newspapers in 8th century Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, one of them might have read something like this: wife dumps prophet to become prostitute. Shocking, isn't it? We're starting a new series this week on the book of Hosea. And in that book, what you're going to find is God transmitting his message through Hosea in those three ways that we described a little bit earlier. And the story that kicks off the book of Hosea is a story that I don't think you would have heard often at Sunday school if you went along when you were young. Basically, it's this. Hosea was a man of God, a prophet, in fact, probably the most prominent prophet in Israel at the time. His wife, Gomer, and he had 3 children, and then she turned her back on him, rejected his love, walked out on him and their family, and began a life of promiscuity that ended up in prostitution. I said you wouldn't have heard it in Sunday school. When I was young, a kind of young teenager, my friend David Curry and I, when it was a particularly long sermon, we used to look for rude words in the King James Bible. And goodness me, we thought we had hit the jackpot when we came across Hosea chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. Here, I'm going to read it to you in the King James Version. The beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea. And the Lord said to Hosea, "Go take unto thee a wife of whoredoms, and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord." So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of the blame. Hosea 1, verses 2 to 3. What can you say in response to that? A wife of whoredom, children of whoredom, and committing great whoredom. This is a Bible uncensored. I have to admit that out of mischief, when I got home from church a little bit later, I asked my mum if she could help me understand a Bible verse, and then I showed her those verses and said, "Mum, what's whoredom?" I'm ashamed to admit it, I can't remember what she said. But here's the same verse in a more modern translation. When the Lord first began speaking to Israel through Hosea, he said to him, "Go and marry a prostitute, so that some of her children will be conceived in prostitution." This will illustrate how Israel has acted like a prostitute by turning against the Lord and worshipping other gods. And so Hosea married Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim. Other translations describe Gomer as a promiscuous woman or a wife of adultery. Now, it's not completely clear whether God is telling Hosea to go and marry someone who's already promiscuous, who's already a prostitute, or whether he's predicting that that's what's going to happen. It really isn't clear in the Hebrew language that she's going to turn out to become a prostitute, or she was a prostitute before he married her. Anyway, remember that I was saying earlier on that God transmits his message through prophets by proclamation and prediction and demonstration. Well, God told Hosea that this marriage, this broken marriage, his heartbroken experience with his wife, was going to be a lived out demonstration of God's relationship with his people. He's saying that it's going to show how Israel has acted like a prostitute by turning against the Lord and worshipping other gods, and what his reaction would be. Hosea's marriage to Gomer was to be one of those live action parables designed to help us understand God and his reaction and relationship to sinners. I've got to say that this, as well as being the most scandalous story almost in the Old Testament, is the most amazing. It seems like after a few years of marriage, Gomer dumped Hosea and their children, and she ran after a series of lovers. And when we next meet Gomer in chapter 3, she has hit absolute rock bottom. She's in a slave market, being sold cheap. She's damaged goods. And we know that because experts tell us that the price that Hosea paid for Gomer when she was up for sale was about half what was normally paid for a good-looking female slave. We don't know all the details, but I suspect what happened to Gomer was something like this. She was drawn into a series of relationships with men in which she was increasingly used and abused. And men that she thought loved her became her pimps. It's a story that's repeated around the world, and today we would probably say that she was a victim of sex trafficking. Maybe if Gomer lived today, to give you a little bit of an idea of what we're describing here, she'd probably be trapped by some human traffickers in a seedy massage parlour in a city like London, being forced to service men, and then her performances being shown on something like Pornhub. This was a degrading life that she was trapped in. And now Gomer's latest pimp had decided that she was just damaged goods. She was not attractive enough anymore to attract enough men, and so he sends her off to the slave market to be sold off at a knockdown price for a quick sale. Imagine how that made her feel. And now, before we read what happened, I need to remind you, this is a live action parable. Hosea is representing God in what we're about to hear that he's going to do. He's demonstrating and experiencing God's feelings and reactions in his relationship with Israel. And Gomer is the representative of Israel. Let's hear what happened, and I'm promising you this is going to take your breath away. Love to your wife again. Though she's loved by another man and is an adulteress, love her as the Lord loved the Israelites. Though they turned to other gods and loved the sacred raisin cakes, so I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and lethek of barley.
Hosea 3 verses 1 and 2.
I want to ask you to do something for me now. I want you to try and imagine the scene at that slave market. Gomer is there, probably hiding at the back. She's feeling unloved and unlovable and worthless. She's probably racked with regret and guilt as she realises that the choices that she's made in her life has brought her to this point, to absolute rock bottom. And then she hears a voice, and it sounds faintly familiar. She thinks it's a voice from her past, and for a moment she fears it's one of her past abusers who'll buy her and abuse her again. Then the voice gets clearer, and she hears the man shouting, I want the one at the back, that one at the back, yes, her. And then she hears the crowd begin to gasp, and then gossip, and then giggle. And she hears people starting to say things like, Hosea, are you serious? That's Gomer, the whore who dumped you and has slept with half the men in Samaria. Imagine what was going through her mind. Hosea, you can't buy her. Think of your position as a prophet. You can't be a holy man of God and have that whore back in your home. Hosea, that's the woman that made a mockery of you. She made you a laughing stock. You can't love her. She brought shame on you and on your family. But Hosea fights his way to the front. In front of everyone else who are laughing and mocking and maybe in shock, he says, I don't care what she's done. I don't care what she looks like. I don't care what she's become. I don't care how much she's hurt me. I don't care how little she loved me. I don't care that she didn't love me like I loved her. I love her. I'll always love her. And I want her back, and I want to bring her back into a loving relationship with me. Now I need you to imagine something else. I want you to try and imagine how Gomer, this unfaithful and ungrateful woman, felt at that moment when she realises that the one whose love she rejected and pushed away and walked away from, the one that she hurt so deeply and painfully, that person has searched for her and he's found her. And now he's paying the price to set her free from the mess that she's gotten herself into and that she can't free herself from. Imagine how Gomer felt. And Hosea just doesn't want to set her free so that she can slink off and hide in shame and in some dark corner and never be seen again in polite society. Hosea says that he still loves her and he wants to reconcile with her and restore her to a loving relationship with him. And in this scandalous, crazy, irrational love of Hosea for Gomer, God's word says that we have a window into God's heart, and what we see at the heart of God is grace for people who don't deserve it. Hosea and Gomer's story is the story of God and Israel. God entered into a covenant relationship, a relationship of love, a marriage relationship, if you like, with Israel, when he set them free from Egypt. He did that on Mount Sinai, and he brought them into the promised land, and he showered his blessing on them. But Israel, just like Gomer, was ungrateful and unfaithful and ran after other gods and other kings. She prostituted herself with others. The love that should have been for God, she gave to others. And God here through Hosea is promising that he was going to find Israel after the mess that she got herself into, and he was going to bring her back into a new relationship, a new covenant with himself, with a new king. Here's a point that I need you to grasp. The story of Hosea and Gomer isn't just a story of God and Israel. It's the story of you and God. It's the story of every one of us and God. In this crazy, irrational, one-way love that Hosea had for Gomer, we get a snapshot of what grace is really all about. And how God feels about us, and how he treats us as sinners who all too often, just like Gomer, have been ungrateful and unfaithful. And just like Gomer, when we were far from God, he came looking for us. He pursued us to express his love for us. And here's the wonder, he didn't send someone else to find us. He came himself to find us and rescue us. And that's why Jesus said, when he was summing up what he was doing, what his mission was, he said he'd come to seek and save the lost. He come to pursue and find you and set you free. And just like Hosea, he was willing to pay the price to set us free so that we could be restored and reconciled to him. And when Jesus and the apostles wanted to explain what the cross was all about and what Jesus was going to achieve for us through the cross and how it would impact our life, one of the main ways they did that was by using this idea of the slave market and paying a price, a ransom, as it was called, to redeem or set free a slave. They described the cross as being just like what Hosea did for Gomer. It was an act of redemption, a price that was paid to set us free from the mess that we'd gotten ourselves into and couldn't free ourselves from. Just listen to Peter as he describes what Jesus did for you. For you know that your lives were ransomed once and for all from the empty and futile way of life handed down from generation to generation. It was not a ransom payment of silver or gold which eventually perishes, but the precious blood of Christ, who like a spotless, unblemished lamb was sacrificed for us. I want you to say something to yourself. I want you to say something to your soul and to allow it to soak into the very depth of your being. I am Gomer. Deeply unworthy, but deeply loved. Andy Stanley says, grace is the offer of exactly what we do not deserve. Thus it can't be recognised or received until we're aware of precisely how undeserving we really are. It's the knowledge of what we do not deserve that allows us to receive grace for what it is, unmerited, unearned, undeserved. And for that reason, grace can only be experienced by those who acknowledge that they're undeserving. Can you acknowledge that you're Gomer? You see, it's only when you and I admit to ourselves that there is Gomer in us and that we realise that God is Hosea, that we begin to understand how amazing grace really is, and then can begin to experience and express it to others. The grace of God is the love of God that pursues you and finds you when you've run away from him. Grace is the love of God that seeks you out when you've nothing to give in return but an empty hand. Grace is a love that loves you even at your most unlovable and unworthy. Grace is, in a sense, nothing to do with you and what you've done, and everything to do with God and what he's done for you. Grace is rooted in the very nature of God, who he is, and expressed in what he does. It's not earned or deserved by who you are and what you've done. And the wonder of it is that grace means that we can't make God love us, because he has always loved us and always will love us. Grace means, in the words of a children's song with an adult message, there is nothing that I can do or say to make God love me more. There is nothing that I can do or say to make God love me less. And if you don't remember anything else about this message, remember that. Remember that, for in that you grasp grace. Just like Gomer and Hosea, there is nothing that you have done, nothing that you are doing or will do that will make God love you more or make God love you less. For you can never sin yourself beyond the grace of God, and can never find yourself in a place where his love won't pursue you and find you, because his love is dependent on him and not on you. And the gospel through Hosea that we've heard today to you is this: no matter what you do, no matter how sinful you were or are or might become, no matter the messes that you've landed yourself in, God will pursue you, stalk you, and romance you with his irrational, passionate, radical grace that flows from his heart, who he is and not who we are. It's a grace that loved you when you were unlovable and embraces you even when you feel unworthy, and has redeemed you at great cost, because you, whatever you feel about yourself and other people have told you about yourself, you are precious to him. You were redeemed with the precious blood of Christ, and he wants that to set you free and reconcile you to him and restore you to a loving relation to him. We need to grasp grace, the amazing nature of grace, because we can't become a Christian or live as a Christian without grasping grace. This whole message series in Hosea is meant to help you grasp grace. And I want you to do two things. I really want to encourage you to do two things to help you do that. Firstly, on Wednesday, I'm going to put up a little video called Deeper. And we're going to look a little bit more about why grace is so important and why it's foundational to Christian spirituality and Christian community. So tune in for that. And the second thing is that we're going to send out every day for the next 2 weeks a daily devotional on Hosea. Grab a coffee, a tea, or whatever's your drink of preference. Sit down, read it, and soak in the grace of God through the message of Hosea. And let's talk about it. Let's get amazed, Westlake, all